Just wanted to say a huge thank you and welcome to everyone here, especially our guest. If you don't want to be in the recording, you can turn your camera off. She is Professor of Political Theory. We'll be discussing, amongst other things, her book Free, which has been shortlisted and awarded various awards and has been translated into, I think, 19 languages. And I guess I'm here to welcome you all on behalf of ENORB, which is the European Network of Religion and Belief, and represented here by colleagues Lorenzo, Claudia and Mireia. So if you can wave and let yourselves known to the rest of everyone, fantastic. I'm actually working with an organisation called Hibiscus, and we're a UK charity. We work with and for Black, minoritised and migrant women that are caught up in the UK's immigration and criminal justice system. So it's really exciting to be able to be here as a host for another organisation discussing such an important book and talking with Lea directly. So this is one of a series of events that ENORB will be hosting, and there'll be more details on all of that as well. Before we kick off, just some housekeeping. We'll be recording this session, as you've seen, so please keep your mics off for most of this, because we want to get the best possible sound recording to share with others. But do use the chat throughout. If things occur to you, if you've got questions that pop up, put them in the chat, because we will be reviewing that as we go and we'll come back to you. I'll start with some questions and a broad discussion about the book with Lea, but then I'll open that up to everybody, and it would be great to hear your questions and thoughts when that happens. And so, you know, use the hand emoji, we'll come to you directly, or use the chat. So I think with no further delay, as it were, welcome, Lea. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think it's fair to say when I first read your book, it was very profound and quite personal. So a lot of my reflections on it are quite personal as well. And in it, you describe your childhood and adolescence in Albania, the end of the socialist regime there, and the chaotic onslaught, I guess, of liberal capitalism. I think when I started reading it, I was thinking it was going to be very intimidating and academic, and I found it absolutely disarming and completely engrossing. I'm just interested to know, really, as an academic, how did you come to write your own personal story? That must be quite different territory.
Great, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for hosting me and for everyone for joining. It was really the result of an accident, and the accident was COVID-19. So I was in Berlin, and I had started to write this academic book on freedom in the liberal and socialist traditions of political thought, and it was very much in continuation with my other academic work. And as I started doing the research, I was on sabbatical. As I started doing the research for the book, the lockdown happened, and I have three small children, all of whom were running around the house and were trying to play, and because I didn't really understand why we weren't on holiday, so we were supposed to work. And somehow I ended up locking myself in this big cupboard in Berlin to try and write. And it was, it was a German cupboard, so it was quite large, but it was still not a library. So it was inside this cupboard where I was writing this academic book that it occurred to me that there are moments in history where freedom, which was supposed to be the topic of my book, is not as abstract and as difficult to grasp as it seems. And the absence of freedom is also not that hard to notice. And so if you're in cupboard writing, and if you can't go to, meet your friends, and if you can't travel to Albania to see your family, or if your kids can't go to the playground, it's not very hard to see that there's no freedom there. So it's like there's immediate connection to the absence of something. And it also occurred to me that there had been and the other thing was the discourse around COVID-19, which was very much a discourse around crisis, and the fact that the media kept saying that things will never be again the same, and we're on a cusp of a kind of change of system, and there's a lot of uncertainty around the future. And that was also something I had heard at various other points in my life, especially coming from Albania, where we'd experienced a massive transition from one system to the other. There were these moments of great uncertainty where you didn't know what the future was going to look like. And so it occurred to me that there had been other times in my life where I had had this personal experience of freedom, and as both a promise, but also as a betrayal, as sometimes an illusion. And so when I started writing that academic book, the more I was writing under lockdown conditions, the more personal the writing became. And the more personal it became, the more I was kind of going back to Albania and recovering episodes of my childhood. And I felt also somewhat as an academic freer to write in those conditions, because somehow the world was different around me. So I didn't feel as constrained by the norms of academic writing. So I found freedom in the writing, as it were, even though there wasn't freedom in the world. So that was how it all came somehow it all started.
That's amazing. And I think always when there are constraints, it creates, like you say, a new space, new ideas and new things to push against. I mean, was it very different? And was it uncomfortable in any way, sort of that kind of rather more personal disclosure? I can't.
Well, yeah, it was very difficult, especially at the beginning. Well, no, it actually is very difficult still to write in that mode, because what's very difficult about it is that as an academic, you have a discipline that you speak to, and there's boundaries and there's constraints, there's literature, and you refer to the literature when you make your argument. And so you feel like you're in much more stable, solid territory. Whereas when you're writing between literature and philosophy, and the more you go into literature, the more there are no constraints. You could write about anything. And in my case, there was a constraint, because I was writing about my life and I was writing about people I had met. And so there were reality was a constraint somehow. But even there, you could interpret it in many different ways. And you could, from a methodological perspective, it's very, very different. So it's very hard as an academic when you don't have a field of research that you're referring to when you're writing the book, to just know how to pitch it, how to write the argument, how to make sure that you're not hammering the reader with a lot of kind of concepts and abstract stuff and making it unreadable, like you said, or, when you kind of expecting to read something from an academic, intimidating. Yeah, that was, so those are all very hard decisions, because on the one hand, as I say, being an academic, you want to write about something that you know, and you want to write in a way that is authoritative. But on the other hand, you don't want to lecture the reader. You want to give them freedom when they read to interpret the way they want and to pick the things that they want to pick from the book. And that making that balance, finding the balance between, on the one hand, wanting to say certain things, and on the other hand, not saying them in a certain way, but saying them in a way that is more inviting and that people can identify with more, and that can evoke feelings in them or emotions that are not necessarily the emotions that usually we don't. When you read academic books, you don't feel a lot of emotions. It just kind of it engages your reason and your understanding, but it doesn't engage you in a personal level. And to find that line between, as I say, having content and having concepts, but also mobilizing people's feelings, I think that's the hardest thing to do.
No, and I think it's incredibly effective. And my own background, I was brought up in the UK, very socialist background myself, but in a very, very different context. So it touched a nerve in lots of different places in quite unexpected ways. Where would you say, where are you now on freedom? What does it mean to be free, and what's necessary for that to be realized from where you stand at the moment?
Yeah. So one of the things that the book tries to do, which is a little bit different from what I try to do in my academic work, is to really have conversations about freedom between different characters and not to settle it for the reader. So part of the book is written from a child's perspective, and part of the reason is that the child doesn't really have a strong view on the world. They just receptive to other people's views. They're a witness, and they record all the things that they hear and all the discussions. And in the book, there are different characters, all of which have a different idea of freedom. So my mother has a more liberal, right-wing, kind of libertarian, almost Thatcherite idea of freedom. My father has a more social democratic, more robust kind of social idea of freedom. And then there's a character who's my grandmother, who has the vision of freedom that I find I am most sympathetic to still, and that has shaped me philosophically. And her idea of freedom is slightly different from these other two, because it's all about internal freedom. So she is someone who shows throughout her life and through her experiences that you can be oppressed externally and you can live in oppressive circumstances, but you find an internal freedom to resist making certain compromises, and you find a kind of inner dignity of the human being. And in that dimension of moral responsibility and kind of expression of moral agency, that's where you know that you really are free, that you could have compromised, or you could have said yes to something that's degrading, but you don't do it, or you resist. And it's there that you find that that moment of dignity, which is expressive, I think, of freedom. So, and that's kind of what I think about freedom now, in terms of, and actually that's also what I've always thought philosophically. I was very drawn to German idealism, and to especially to the work of Kant and Hegel, and to some extent Marx afterwards. But part of the reason I was drawn to that conception of freedom is that it's not about preference satisfaction. It's not about desires. It's about rational desires. So it's about knowing something is rationally justified. And then in the moment in which you try to realize what you think is rationally justified, that's where you reveal your freedom. And I think that's a very important, that notion of moral freedom is a really important element of social critique, because it enables you to distinguish between freedom and ideology. So it enables you to distinguish between the freedom that you experience from this moral perspective and the lack of freedom in the institutions that surround you and the way they try to appropriate and misappropriate it and sometimes tell you, you're in a free society. But then if you exercise this critical thinking, you realize that it's not as free as you thought it was, or that there is a moment of kind of ideology in every system that is trying to present certain things to you as being freedom. But then when you think about it from a moral perspective, it turns out that it's not. And so I guess for me, that moral perspective is the starting point for something then a bit larger and a bit more engaged socially with the world, and meaning really the world, not just, there's this state or this community or that community, but the unit is really humanity. And so you think about what is it that is conducive to freedom for everyone at all places all the time. So.
No, I think that's, I mean, I absolutely fell in love with Nina, your grandmother, when I was reading the book. She came across as incredibly wise, and yeah, her experience is incredible as well. I think it's really interesting, actually, that sort of personal dimension. I think it's really powerful in terms of, like you say, even when there are different constraints, you still have a choice to resist, or you still have a choice to not give your consent. And that's really powerful, I think, particularly when, there are lots of people whose freedom is constrained. I'm thinking particularly in the UK context, where many immigrants are ending up in detention indefinitely and things like that. I'm going to put a question out broadly just to kick off a bit of the chat, but maybe everyone here today might, share your reflections in terms of what your personal experience or your personal ideal of freedom is. It would be interesting to see some of that. It's in the chat now, so please do type away if you have something. In terms of your grandmother, actually, you mentioned both your parents' reactions, quite strong reactions in terms of your choice in studying philosophy and politics in particular, but hers I'm not so sure of. What was her reaction?
Well, she was, I think, much more tolerant actually than either of my parents. In part, I think because she was never a person that was thinking instrumentally. So my parents were really worried when I picked philosophy, because they were thinking instrumentally as something like you do something at university so that you can become this person. And they weren't quite sure that you could do anything with philosophy in addition to all the ideological reservations they had. I mean, coming from Albania, they really hadn't done much philosophy in school. So all philosophy in communist Albania was Marxist-Leninism with a very particular interpretation. So it wasn't even Marxist-Leninist, it was a dialectical materialism. So basically Marx, Stalin, Lenin, and a very particular canon, and everything else that didn't conform with that canon was not considered to be acceptable. So they had a very narrow idea of philosophy. And that's why they were really reluctant to let me go and study in Italy, because it was a lot of sacrifice for them and for me, and for something that they weren't sure that was the right thing to do anyway, but also not the right thing to do professionally, even if they had thought that it was the right thing to do in terms of choice of subject. Because they were, you have to do something like become a lawyer or become an economist or become, have a profession, have a job. And at the particular point in which I made this choice, this was 1997 in Albania. And it was in the aftermath of a very profound conflict between it wasn't even different social groups. It was just a kind of armed conflict that had emerged as a result of a financial collapse of pyramid schemes. But it was a very traumatic moment in the history of the 90s. Because the state really had run out of control over society, and there was there was looting, and there were violent shootings everywhere. People were dying on a daily basis. It was just complete chaos. It was sort of the state of nature. And it was very hard for me to decide to study a subject. If you thought about what do I study law? And there was no law anywhere. It was just like armed people shooting each other. It was complete anarchy. Or if you thought about studying economics, these financial schemes had just collapsed and the economy was had fallen apart. So it was really hard. Or if you think about medicine, there was someone dying every day. So I only had questions, and I wanted to study something that would enable me to ask better questions. Somehow I didn't know what I wanted to be, or didn't know that I wanted to be someone in particular. So I just was at a very open moment. And that's why I picked philosophy, because it was a kind of thing that you could just have more questions, and it's a kind of field that's science that helps you ask better questions and with more knowledge about how these questions were answered in the past. So that's why that's why I picked it. But to go back to your initial question, my grandmother, because she was not thinking instrumentally like my parents in terms of you do something so that you can become a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, because in her life, in a way, every time she had tried to think instrumentally, it had completely backfired. I mean, nothing had gone according to plan. So she was more of the idea that you do something that you're committed to and you want to do and you have a reason for doing, and then the rest will kind of come together somehow, or may not, but that's not reason to not do it. So I think she was much more encouraging than my parents throughout this process.
Yeah, no, I think one of the other things that I found really interesting is the role of religion. So obviously, you know, your family have their own religious background, but it's very peripheral in your childhood. There are Christians and Muslims, but there's no religious observance. It's very different from, I guess, growing up elsewhere in Europe at that point. But when Enver dies, the death of Uncle Enver, as it's framed in the book, it prompts a discussion of religion in school, and it feels like the party and his death and his status took on this almost religious significance. It's invested with that kind of, I guess, yeah, religious significance. How do you view religion alongside all the other various belief and ideological systems that are debated within the book, I guess?
Well,
and do you think there's something fundamental, I guess, about religious experience that means that even atheistic ideologies use or take on those trappings?
Well, I guess there is something about religion which, if you think about it really, really broadly, so in very abstract terms, not about this particular religion or that particular religion, but I think what is unique to it and important, I guess, is the fact that it gives you this dimension of meaning in life that otherwise would be meaningless. So, you know, what religion does is it gives you a perspective on the world that makes it worth thinking about, okay, why is there something other than nothing? And why should I carry on doing this? And it's just in the widest possible terms, not in terms of commitment to this particular religion or that particular religion. What it does is it fills the gap in what would otherwise be this very kind of nihilistic perspective. You know, what is the point of life in a way? And I do think that there is something so there is a kind of revealed religion, which are all the historical religions that we know of. And Albania was in a very unique case because at one point in the late 60s, it abolished all religions officially, and it became the only officially atheist country in the world. It had atheism in its constitution, and the churches and the mosques were turned down, and they were replaced by youth centers and sports centers. And so there was a very aggressive attack against all forms of revealed religion. And at that point, yeah, the state still needs some kind of belief, and the religion becomes the ideology in a way. So the communist ideology became the religion, the state religion, and then what people had to be committed to in terms of symbols, in terms of expression of meaning in their life, in terms of who they revere and who do they think about. And so then Enver Hoxha acquired this, especially after his death, this cult-like figure, and the Communist Party was in the role of, you know, every child in Albania had a mother who was the real mother, and then another mother that was even more important, that was the party. So you get from the very early days of education, you get a quasi-religion education, which is not religion education in terms of going to church and going to mosque, but there is a kind of religion of humanity. And I think, I mean, every system where people have tried to get rid of these historical religions, they've always had to come up with a secular religion somehow. So if you think about the French Revolution, at some point they decide to take on the clergy and so on. And what do they have? They have Robespierre, and they have the God of Reason and so on. So they all create a set of symbols that's kind of important to them. So I think, I mean, that's where I am, I guess, right now. Yeah, what do I think about religion now? I suppose, you know, atheism is also kind of religion, because it's such a strong belief in the fact that there is such strong commitment and such a strong expression that there isn't anything, that there is nothing, that, you know, God doesn't exist. That to me seems like a faith in itself. And so I'm not sure that I'm an atheist either. I think I now define myself as agnostic, meaning that I just don't ask myself the question. And I think you carry on, and you can be tolerant of people who feel the need to have a more doctrinal perspective in their lives, but you can also maybe find ways of filling that gap with other things and make sense of the world without it. And my grandmother had a very secular religion, I would say, and whenever we talked about God, she wouldn't say God doesn't exist, but she always said to me, well, you know, God is in my conscience. And I found that quite powerful, actually. And I kind of still think that is the right answer somehow.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to that kind of moral center in terms of that's the moral choices you make and how that exhibits in terms of freedom as well. That's That's really interesting. There's a lot of trauma. It's a lot of humour in your book, but there is also a lot of trauma, and sometimes the humour masks that trauma. And I think that's partly, I would assume, to do with the child's perspective and the child's experience. And so much of what comes across is how hard your family worked to protect you from some of the constraints and difficulties there as well. But I think especially after the fall of socialism, you know, there are horrific tales about, you know, friends of yours that disappeared and people in the Adriatic and stuff like that drowning, and then the pyramid scheme. So I think you disappear as an author, and a lot of that is represented through your own direct diaries. Which is unusual. It's a real mix between that kind of adolescent angst and then Kalashnikovs and riots, and it's very disorientating but incredibly powerful and moving. And why did you choose to present your diary, I guess, in that way, to express that particular phase?
Because I found it very hard to depict a rupture like that from the point of view of now. So I remember I was actually writing, I had got to this point in the book, and I write in a very linear way. So I start from chapter 1, go to chapter 2, chapter 3. Some authors start from the end, go back to the beginning, go to the middle. So they're much more disordered in the way they write. I have a much more, because of academic writing, I guess, much more structured way of writing. So I kind of get to the chapters chronologically. So I had gotten to that point of the book, and I knew I wanted to write about 97 because it was such an important point, I thought, in the transition in Albania, and also important to tell certain stories that hadn't been told or hadn't been told in that way up to that point. And I remember thinking about how would I describe a situation that is like a war. And one of the things that I found hardest is that as a writer, when you create the point of view from a perspective about the past, but from the point of view of now, you have a kind of narrative coherence. And one of the things that I remember from experiencing the war in 97 was that there was no coherence. So one day you'd wake up and think, oh, it's fine. It's not so different from how it was yesterday or how it was the year before. And another day you'd think, like, literally, we're going to die. There was this existential fear and anxiety about the minute that would come after. You know, the Kalashnikov started, people started shooting just outside you, and you could feel the bullets clinking on the window, and you could really, like, the noise was so paralyzing, and you were just really scared, and you thought you were going to die. So for me, it was really hard to write with a kind of narrative coherence, just this point that, you know, one moment you can be really optimistic and feel it's all normal and fine, and one moment you can be so traumatized that when I reread the diaries, I had actually forgotten that I had thought these thoughts, that you're so traumatized that you actually suppress all the traumatic memories with the distance. So I had forgotten that I had become suicidal. I had forgotten that I'd lost my voice. There were all these things that I just kind of went back and reread my diary, and I was like, man, this was really hard. And I didn't know how to write it. So I didn't know how to write it from the point of view of now. So I went back to my editor and said to her, look, you know, I don't really know how to write about war. It's, you know, war is sometimes it's safe in one place and unsafe in another. There are times of the day when it's more dangerous and times of the day where it's not dangerous. There are moments where you think there's a compromise around the corner, and there are moments where you think, how long is this going to last? It's going to last forever. So, and in my diary, all of these things were present within the space of a month or two. So I said to her, look, I don't know how to write about this. What I'm going to do is I'm literally going to copy paste from my diary. So that chapter was the easiest to write because I didn't do anything. I didn't edit anything. I didn't change anything. I mean, I cut some bits that were more kind of emotional, personal, in terms of, like, you know, I like this guy and I wrote a lot more about this guy than I actually ended up publishing in the book because it wasn't really relevant to the world. You know, it was only relevant to me at that point. But I did just basically copy paste the bits that I thought were more relevant. And I had just read Svetlana Alexievich, Secondhand Time, who also uses kind of personal witnesses with this idea that you record these moments and it seemed to me a very effective way of actually conveying trauma. So I had kind of been inspired by all these readings. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to copy paste the diary and put it out there. And then hopefully people will understand that this is a teenage diary, and they will see that the voice is slightly different from the rest of the book, and it might work to convey just how exceptional this period was.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely had that impact on me emotionally as well. But it also felt like I was suddenly aware of how much you were managing my journey through the earlier part of your childhood, through the child's view, and suddenly it was like, where's she gone? There's somebody else here, and that was it was very, very powerful. I mean, I'm keen to return to some of the political theory that's there, and like you say, you kind of invest the characters in your life and the people in your life to bring these very abstract ideas into reality and into conflict with each other in real situations, which they never are when you sort of talk about them academically. And like I say, I was brought up with a very idealistic socialist atheistic belief system. And I think there was a really salutary and powerful lesson for me personally at the end of it, which is that observation that people who haven't lived through the failures of a system like that, often, you know, we can often tend to hold it up as this unattainable ideal and go, oh, well, it wasn't done properly, you didn't do it properly. And that in itself is almost a form of kind of cultural supremacy and kind of like, you know, it doesn't take into account the fact that life is messy and complex, and nothing's ever going to be perfect. Nothing's ever going to be the textbook, stuff like that. So I thought that was really, really interesting. But equally, your balance, you know, you do see some real positive public goods in the systems that you were brought up in terms of being able to create community and those, you know, that the real strength of solidarity and how people would support each other, even if they were not aligned in every single way. I think that was really great. I mean, I guess from your perspective, what other positive lessons do we need to learn from socialism without, you know, sort of writing all of that off? You know, what are the positives in that we're in danger of losing or being submerged in individualism and such?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not so much what Albania had, it's more about what Albania had because it wasn't a capitalist society that you didn't have here, because these were capitalist societies. So I think there's two elements in Albania. One of them is that there is a kind of hardship, and because there is scarcity and there is censorship and there is a kind of lack of support, from lack of trust in the state. You know, people are all there mistrusting the state. They find ways of creating community to overcome these obstacles of scarcity, and they share a lot more, and they look after each other, they look after the elders. So there's a much stronger sense of community. But of course, you know, there is scarcity in Albania now as well, and there are difficulties, and there isn't that sense of community. And I think the reason this was the case in communist Albania was that this was not a commodified society. So this was not a society where you can go out in the market and buy a good. So say you need a babysitter, and what you do, you just go on an app and find a babysitter and pay money for it. Or if you don't, then, you know, it's because you don't have the money. But if you don't have the money, it's because you don't deserve to have the money. That's the kind of assumption here. So when society is not commodified like that, and when there isn't a kind of a market value on every service and also on every person, then you have these forms of mutual support that emerge spontaneously, which play a kind of role of cohesion that you lose when society becomes commodified. So now you lose that because people can just pay for a babysitter, or they can just, if they need to clean their house, or if there's a wedding service that you pay for and they organize your wedding for you. So in Albania, we didn't have any of that. So people would just organize weddings together and, you know, go to the school and get all the benches from the local school. And so there was a way of dealing with all these coordination problems that was very, very different. And I suppose that just, I guess, shows you what it is that when you have a commodified society, what does that take away from you? And what it takes away is this human interaction and community, which isn't marketable, and which isn't, you can't kind of attach a market value to it. And in fact, the moment you try to attach a market value, you lose it, because it becomes a customer service. So even, you know, people sometimes comment about how in communist Albania, or in communist countries more generally, because there wasn't this idea of marketization of society, people in the shops weren't generally friendly. You know, you wouldn't go and find a nice shopkeeper, or they weren't like, the services were people were pretty rude. And sometimes I think, well, do you prefer someone to just be spontaneous with you and rude if they had a bad day or if they're tired at work? Or do you prefer knowing that you've actually paid a lot of money for someone to say to you, yes, sir, yes, madam, we'll take care of this, don't worry, just because they know that you've paid and they owe that answer to you. So that's not authentic either. You know, you may like it, maybe nicer, but I think I'd rather have the kind of grumpiness that is sincere than the false politeness that I know that is there because I paid for it and someone is just kind of giving me a service. So I think it's this kind of thing that I suppose I miss, or that I feel that we should think more about. What kind of life do we get when not everything is commodified in this way?
No, I love that phrase, sincere grumpiness. I'm all in favour of that. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think that I'm thinking again, from a UK perspective, I'd be really interested to hear other people's perspectives from elsewhere in Europe. But in the charity space, in the charity sector in the UK, there is increasingly a push for us to move out of relational work and into transactional work, into contracts, into services, and that ties our voice as well. And I think that's that's something that's really quite a worrying development. I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to open it up. So I'm saying that in advance. So people, please do start putting your questions or thinking about what you might want to ask. I have a couple from Lorenzo and Claudio. But before that, I think one of the questions we wanted to explore here is kind of around Albania within Europe at the moment, and in particular around the othering of Albania. So as I mentioned, the organisation I work with works with migrants in both the criminal and the immigration systems in the UK. And there is definitely this really strong and hostile narrative emerging that I think is really, really worrying. I mean, what are your thoughts on that as a development, and how can we counter that from sitting where we do all across Europe and in different organisations?
So I think the first question, I guess there's a question of where does it come from and why it's there, and the second question is what can we do about it? And I think the first question about why it's there, I don't think that is particularly to do with Albanians. I think it's to do with every community that experiences disadvantage, that at some point becomes a scapegoat because they are perceived as rivals, as competitors for certain public goods. So I remember in the UK, Albanians weren't as central to the immigration rhetoric until Brexit got done. So before Brexit, it was all the Poles and the Romanians and Eastern Europeans. Nobody really was talking about Albanians very much in the media. It was all about there's these other EU member states, but like latecomers, and they are competing for the NHS, and they're taking places in school, or they're kind of taking resources from the state. And then Brexit got done, so most of them left. And so then, but the problems didn't get resolved because the crisis wasn't due to Brexit. It wasn't due to kind of being a member of the EU. It was a kind of larger crisis. So because the problem didn't get solved, in a society that uses membership politically to kind of play with it, then you just need to find another community that you can scapegoat. So I think it just happened to be Albanians, but it could have been anyone. And what it was that Albanians were playing a particular function in public discourse, which was to take away attention from the real problems of Britain, from the fact that, it has massive inequality rising, from the fact that there's kind of crisis that keeps building up, and over the last decades there's been no growth. From the fact that Brexit didn't help, that instead of kind of making it this prosperous, competitive society that it was promised to be, it turned out to have like even more labor market shortages and even more problems in the supply of services. And so I think there is a general, and of course, political instability, they're like the kind of prime minister that we're changing with the calendar, all that. So basically, this is a society that politically, if you were to start scratching the surface, you would find a problem anywhere which has to do with state provision and with the fact that this is a government that is not responsive to everyone's concerns. I mean, it's responsive to the concerns of some people very well, but it's not responsive to everybody. So I think, and therefore, the poor and the people who are kind of left out in this war, which is, I think to me, as I see, it's just a war between the rich and the poor in a way. The rich kind of accumulate the resources and they take advantage of their position, and the state kind of keeps investing in them. And then there's people who are constantly disenfranchised and left out from development. And now these people who are disenfranchised, when they go and ask the state, well, why am I not having this? It's really easy to say, well, it's because of the Albanians, or it's because of the Poles, or because of Romanians, rather than blaming politicians themselves. So I feel that migration, not just in the United Kingdom, but in Europe more widely, just plays that political role of being really useful. And these are people who you can't mobilize electorally. So it's really easy to use them because you don't get votes from them because they can't vote. They're not citizens. So they're already disenfranchised. And so you can use them even more to try and build a rhetoric around it's their fault because they are voiceless. They don't have power. So that's where the problem comes from, I think. And as I say, it's just a problem all over Europe. It's not just a problem in Albania, in the UK on the Albanians. It's particular countries have particular minorities that they target. Somewhere in the Netherlands, it's, I don't know, the Muslims, or it changes. And it also changes depending on what goes on in the news. But I think the general pattern is the same. And to me, the first response and the first thing that needs to be done is to disrupt the narrative, to just say, well, migration is not a problem at all, even when it looks like it's a problem. Because the fact that migration is it's about a very simple thing. It's just about people moving from one place to the other. And people have been moving from one place to the other from time immemorial. And everything else that we construct around, but where are they moving from and where are they moving to and so on. These are all artificial conventions. I mean, we are like all other animals, migrants. We go and we look for resources and we kind of try and find a living, and it's kind of normal. All of nature moves all the time, and we're part of nature. And so human beings kind of move all the time as well. So migration is only a problem when it's framed politically as a problem per se. And what it means, I think the first thing we need to do is to just disrupt that narrative and say, look, migration is only a problem because it's the reflection of a larger problem that goes underground, which is inequality and underdevelopment and asymmetric power distributed differently in different parts of the world or between in the same state. So it's because there are parts of the world that are more developed than other parts of the world, and that it's because there are people within one state that have more than other people, that kind of pattern of inequality is what then shapes exit as the only way forward to kind of look for opportunities and for resources. If you had a world that was more or less equal all over, you wouldn't get unilateral flows of migration. So you would get the same amount of people that come from Albania to go to England as you would get from England going to Albania. So you would have this, and then it would just be movement, just like Americans come to the UK and the Brits go to Italy and French people go to Canada or whatever. So this is not the kind of migration that we worry about when we worry about migration. But we don't call it, when we worry about it, we don't say why we worry about it and what is the underlying problem, because we don't, in the state system that we have, I don't think we have the right solutions to address that problem, because the state system only worries about itself. The state only worries about itself, doesn't worry about the world. And because we haven't got the tools in place, it's really easy, as I say, to, I think, instrumentalize membership in this way and to use it by various political elites to construct consent around it.
No, I think yeah, and that I think that's certainly the experience here in the UK. There are a number of questions coming up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Lorenzo to ask one of your questions, and then if we can come back to Andrea, and then Boyata, and then Claudio. So I'll try and remember that as we go. But yeah, Lorenzo, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I would like to go back a bit to the first half of the book. So where like you took us through like a journey through your childhood, and I loved especially like how you managed to write in you as a child, like in that perspective. So I feel like that this is what took us to discover what exactly was going on step by step, just as you did as a child. If I think, for example, about the universities or the biography or your great grandfather. And this is why the end of the regime constitutes, at least for me, like a shock as well. And this made me think in particular, like about one sentence that you had, I don't remember exactly how it was framed, but when you say towards the end, when you see things changing once, you know that they can change again. And so I actually realized that we never actually considered the possibility of our system changing completely, like not in a realistic way. So it's like if right now, like our society is like the triumph of this apparent or capitalistic freedom that gives you the impression that things could change only slightly for worse or for better, but never like radically. Mm-hmm. So my question is, so now, like considering your experience and the tools that you have right now, thanks to your studies and your research, like, do you see the possibility of a radical change of our system in the foreseeable future? And if yes, like in which terms?
Well, I mean, define foreseeable. So I don't know if we will see it in my lifetime. I don't know, because I think one of the problems is that in communist Albania, there was no freedom, and people were aware that there was no freedom. My biggest worry is that in capitalist country, there is no freedom, but everybody thinks it's there somehow. And it's just because they didn't manage to, somebody just wasn't good enough with their job or didn't like aspire enough, or were there was this kind of discourse that justifies why some people perform worse than others. While in communist Albania, it was very clear that it was the state's fault. I'm not really sure that in the West, people are persuaded that it's actually a systemic problem, or that the majority of people are persuaded that it's a systemic problem. The majority of people are persuaded the system is fine, and whoever doesn't succeed, it's because it's their own individual failure. And this is why this discourse, this kind of ideology of freedom is in some ways much more pervasive and much more difficult and much more complicated to challenge than one that says, look, it's about a state that is free. In this ideology where it's the individual that is the bearer of success or failure, it's really hard to then blame the state, because the state says, well, I wasn't telling anyone what to do. Everybody was doing what they thought was the right thing to do, and if they failed, it was their responsibility. So why would you blame the system? So I think the structure and the agent interact in a much more complicated and much more difficult way to kind of unsettle and to challenge. So while top-down society, in a hierarchical authoritarian society, it's very obvious it's the authority. Here, power, I think, is anonymous and it's horizontal, it's not vertical. And so to see that there is power exercised in this anonymous horizontal way, and for people to be aware that there is a real problem with institutions that they need to challenge, this is really complicated. And I think part of the reason, again, why it's complicated is that I think in Western capitalist societies, it's not really the states that make decisions, it's the markets. So the state might like to change. I'm very convinced that most politicians who are there in politics, they could be doing something else and they commit to doing what they do because they genuinely think that they want to change things for the better. But then they get elected in office and then they face the pressures of office. But most importantly, they face the pressures of the market. So they just can't make these decisions. There's austerity, there are, resources that are scarce. The state gets all its resources from the markets are unpredictable, and the markets are not coordinated. So again, this discussion on freedom, that is not a top-down institution. The market is a horizontal, anonymous structure. Everybody does what they think they should be doing, and then there is the total sum is something that nobody controlled and nobody intended. And for some people, this is the greatness of liberal freedom in a way, that we all do, public private vices, public virtues was the kind of discussion in the 18th century when this commercial society ideal was becoming articulated. And it is like that, everybody does what they're meant to do, and then you have this structure. So this is why I think to challenge that takes a lot longer, and it's a lot harder, and it's really hard to also know what you as an individual should be doing within this. So I think, well, we have a kind of division of labor, and we, the artists do something, and the writers do something, and the charity sector does something else, and the politicians do something else. And what matters is that we build coherent discourses of change. But then how these discourses get to have an impact in the world, I'm not really sure that any one of us can really say with any conviction. It's just, you can't predict it. So, but what we can do is, I think we can disrupt the narrative. So we can tell when this is something that we're being told, for example, with migration, we can call it out for what it is, just a kind of piece of ideological rubbish. And that's what we can do, without ambiguity, because that's very obvious what it's doing and who it's serving and why it's playing in the way it's playing. So I think you have the weapons of critique still to some extent, and you can use those. But you can't really use them, I think, to say what should be done. You can only use to say what's going wrong with the world that we have, and that what should be done is a kind of much slower work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to come to Andrea now. Andrea, if you want to turn your microphone on, yeah, you have, great, and ask your question. That would be brilliant.
Yeah. So thanks for the discussion so far. I really enjoyed reading your book. I was curious, I was growing up in a family who were from former Yugoslavia, and there's lots of discussion around Yugoslav nostalgia and kind of thinking about the past fondly. I was curious if is there an equivalent in Albania for the parts that were more positive of the system?
No, I don't think so. I think because Albania was very different from Yugoslavia, and so Yugoslavian socialism was much more liberal than Albanian socialism, which was much more kind of oppressive and constraining. So even when there is nostalgia, it's not nostalgia for the system, it's nostalgia for someone's youth, or for the fact that they were young and they're no longer young. And I think we all have nostalgia for our childhood, or for a period of our life where we had all our life in front of us, and even within the kind of constraints of communism. So I think it's natural to be nostalgic if you haven't had a completely traumatic, individual traumatic past. But I don't think in Albania there is nostalgia for the system, or at least I don't really come across that, but there's other Albanians here, so they can maybe speak for what they experienced, but not that I have sort of noticed.
Anyone else have any thoughts on nostalgia?
Yeah, so many things.
Is that Alan? Alan, did you want to say something? Okay, let's go to Boyata, who also had a question, I think, related to nostalgia. Boyata, are you there? Boyata, can you hear us? I can ask your question because there you are. Would you like to ask your question now?
We can't hear you.
Oh, we have that sound. No, it's not coming through the sound. Do you want me to read it out from the chat? Yeah? Okay. It was just about around nostalgia, but as someone who lived in Berlin, did you recognize it?
Did I recognize Berlin?
No, hold on, he's typing now. Just 1 minute. I'll tell you what, Beata, while you type that, if we can come to Lydiana, you have a question there specifically about the negative narrative in the UK at the moment, yeah?
Yeah. Hi, Lea. Hi, Kate. Thank you for organizing this. It's a pleasure to listen to what you have to say, because you are the person behind that book who wrote and who brought this book for us, and it's very, very interesting to hear your version and how and why you said what you said in the book. I'm working for Shpresa program, which is a charity that works with the Albanian community in UK, and we are working closely now with children, young people, and the very vulnerable people of our community who are affected very badly by the negative narrative. And of course, we are creating the safe space and place for them to speak openly and to have the right advice and support. And we are working with campaigning. We are campaigning with Citizens UK, and we are speaking with MPs and councillors to help us in this. But still, I see the process as very long and difficult. And it looks like only with the time, maybe we can disrupt this, but can you come up with something that can be short time solution maybe, or something that can release a bit the members of our community from this weight that it's not a real something that we have done wrong, but it's, as you explained previously, it's about politics.
Yeah, I think I have thought about this a lot as well, especially because living in the UK, I sort of noticed the narrative slightly changing. And then at some point, I'm in a very safe space. You know, academia is generally very progressive and very sheltered. But I know people from the community. So, you know, there's lots of, in my neighborhood, there are lots of Albanian workers and waiters. And so people who are not in privileged positions, who are much more exposed. And I started really noticing that this was a real problem when people started coming to me and saying, actually, you know, my son in school was being told you're Albanian and
go back to your country.
I noticed people and go back to your country. And these were children that were born in the UK. And I noticed that people were actually afraid to speak up, or, you know, they had visa rejections. At some point I wrote a piece about how my mother was denied a visa. And then I started getting loads of messages from people saying, I found this visa letter really humiliating and really degrading the whole process of kind of applying. But everybody in the community had just been swallowing this stuff quietly without saying anything, because they had just normalized that this is what it means to be an immigrant in a society, in a host state. You know, this is what it takes to integrate, means to just take all the rubbish that people throw at you and not say anything because you don't have a voice, you're not a political member, you're not fully integrated yet. So I feel like the first thing that needs to be done is to just make people come out more. In a way, you remember with Me Too, what happened was that people were suddenly just feeling more empowered to just tell the stories. And I don't think it necessarily will change things if you just say what your experience is. But I think it will convince at least a part of the British public who thinks this is a made-up problem. It's not true. You know, there's just like a couple. So the dominant narrative is there are a lot of Albanian criminals, and then there's some people who are complaining about being demonized, but like really the balance is more on the criminal side than on the people who are doing their job and kind of feeling demonized. And I think if we enabled them, if we had spaces and we kind of advertise and publicize those spaces where people come and share their stories, then a lot of people would notice that this is a real issue and it affects children. The second thing I also noticed is education. So somebody was sending me bits from books about children where there were descriptions of Albanians, and this was out of the world. So there was this book for children that somebody shared, and these are all people I don't know. They just write to me because they know that I have contacts and I can kind of talk about this and so on. there was a book about a children's book who was talking about Albanian kidnappers and Albanians kind of coming from the north of Albania. And the setting of this was completely made up. So it was about McDonald's charity concert. And I was like, this person who's written this book has no idea. They don't even know that there is no McDonald's in Albania. It doesn't exist. They were talking about obesity. And I'm like, there is no obesity in Albania. So it was a completely weird combination of things that you know about the West and stereotypes about Albanians, and a combination. This is the worst possible combination of all this. And this was in a school book for children. So people at school learn this narrative, absorb it, recognize it then when it's advertised in the media, and then subscribe to it. So if we don't kind of challenge this every single time we see it, like there's a book or there's a text and you kind of call it out and you put it out there and you write to your MP or you tell people this is not acceptable, it will build up. And even if it's kind of released, at some point Albanians are released from it, it will build up for someone else who doesn't have the courage to speak. So it needs to really be, I think, dismantled as a narrative as a whole, but with these real small examples of people coming out and sharing their stories.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to go to Tom now. Tom's had his hand up for a while, and then Claudio, and then Lorenzo, if that's okay. And then I'm just keeping an eye on time as well.
Thank you for weaving together themes of freedom and nostalgia with humour, and bringing in together my own personal reflections on that, which are stuck in the chat about being able to walk along the seashore, whether it's rain or shine, whatever that means something to me. One of my favourite parts to do that in the British Isles is the Isle of Man. Whenever I visit that, it's like going back 50 years in time. So that mean of relative freedom and nostalgia is very strong to me. The reason I mention the Isle of Man, one of the favoured sons of the Isle of Man was Norman Wisdom, an almost forgotten comic of the 1950s. The younger British people here won't remember him. I just about barely do. And he became a cult hero almost in Albania. You must have grown up with him. And I just wondered if that image of a little man pushing against the class-ridden British snobbery in the system and all that still rides true in Albania today, because apparently he was the only person you could see on Western films was Norman Wisdom in your youth.
Yeah, I think the younger generations will have forgotten him, and I don't think he's as popular now as he was. I mean, during communism, he was the kind of window, the acceptable, because the narrative around the United Kingdom was that this was a kind of Anglo-American imperialist country that had been dominating and colonizing. But somehow the only acceptable face to the communist regime of Britain was Norman Wisdom and this kind of character Pitkin, who was like at the center of all these films that we were all watching. But I think it's only there for a certain generation and then it stopped being shown. So I don't think the younger generations will, I mean, I might be wrong, but I think they're not as familiar as I am, for example.
But I wasn't just asking about him, I was asking what he represents, which is the little man railing against a class-ridden system. Now, is that theme relevant or not?
No, I don't think so. I think all of that is gone, because I think one of the things that happened in Albania with the fall of communism, so this is the tragic thing as well of communism in Albania. Communism was saying a lot of lies to its citizens, basically. The state was lying a lot to its citizens. But in lying, there were also some truths about capitalism. So, it's true that capitalist countries are unequal. It's true that there is class segregation in Britain. It's true that there is racism. It's true that there is sexism. There were, in the lies, there were some truths as well. The problem is that when you fundamentally mistrust the state and emerge from that period of fundamental mistrust, you no longer trust the truths as well. So the truths become lies and as well. And so there is nothing left. It's the conceptually, it's a vacuum. And that's what I find really, really hard, and why I think the situation in Albania and a lot of other East European countries is completely paralyzed for the future, because people just don't believe in anything. There is no vision. The only thing they believe in is exit. They just believe in leaving the country and going somewhere else and see what happens there. And even that, it's done in this kind of much more adventurous way of, I'm just going to try it out. And it's not working here anyway, so I might as well just take a risk. So I think this is what I find the hardest thing about the legacy of communism, in addition to all the things that people still talk about, the historical injustice and the trauma and the damage to the victims. And there's all these kind of things that are obviously there, the result of historical injustice. But what is really tragic for the present is the collapse of belief in a new system, in the possibility of a systemic alternative. And that's, I think Albanians really struggle with that, and a lot of Eastern Europeans really struggle with that. So they just end up being really cynical, really apathetic, really skeptical about everything, and really hard to convince. And when I go around saying, yeah, but you have to believe in something, like you can't live a life without believing in a prospect, or believing in change, or believing that you can kind of, like you say, hold the powerful to account and kind of ask them questions. And so everyone is like, oh, you know, what are you going to get out of it? So there's just no motivation. And that's really I think the worst of the damage in a way.
So it's not just atheism, it's an absence of belief.
Yeah, it's an absence of belief, and especially the absence of belief in kind of, so people believe in individual adaptation. They believe that they can do things by themselves. Like, you know, my mom, she's a very good example of that. Like, she has a problem, she just goes and tries to solve it by herself. Like, she doesn't wait for people to kind of coordinate and so on. But there are some problems that you can't solve that way. So there are some problems that require collective action. I mean, migration is one of them. It's not like the individual before these social forces is completely powerless. So it does need coordination, it does need a vision, and it does need belief in an alternative. And I think that is what's gone. People just don't believe in collective alternatives, and they just believe in leaving.
There is no such thing as society, someone used to say in Britain.
Yes, I remember her.
Right.
But don't forget, if I can say something, even the corrupted system that continued for more than 30 years now affected this as well. Because of me, I left the country 3 years ago, and of course I couldn't believe in the system, because the system failed me more than once. And in 32 years is a long time to live in the same corrupted country where you cannot make the difference, when you don't have a say. And if you become one of them, you become one of them. You cannot make the change.
I agree with that. But yeah, absolutely. No, completely. I totally agree with that. But I think I also find that one of the problems is also with how the corruption discourse works in Albania. So the corruption discourse works by telling you this politician is stealing money, or this politician is kind of rigging the system. But actually every person, when they go into power, they start doing that. So that also shows you that it's kind of structural, that it's not about this person is a good person or this person is a bad person. It's an incentive system that works in such a way that you're colluding with the oligarchs or with the people who have money and so on. And again, that's another narrative that I think needs to be challenged. What do we mean when we talk about corruption in Albania? How does that connect to the way we've built society in the last 30 years? Why is it that no party, whichever party comes to power, why is it that they all end up doing the same things? So I think that needs to be somehow part of the challenge. And we need to kind of construct a way of thinking about that goes beyond just we are a corrupt people and we are people who are just stealing money from state. Why are we doing that?
Don't forget that the same people are doing politics for 30 years in Albania. That's why it's very, very hard to change. Doesn't matter how idealistic you can be or how much you want to change. There are the same people still there, and they built a very strong base now. It's very difficult to change that. I know a lot of young people that they want to make the change, and they decided at the end to leave that country because they couldn't. It's very, 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 very difficult.
No, I know. I mean, it's the same. I have the same experience. When I talk to young people, they say exactly the same thing. But I also have the experience of even those who did stay and that were younger, they did get involved and then they were swallowed. So even there were people who were from like civil society, were much more activist. So I was in 97, I was part of this kind of Soros debating groups and so on. Some of them stayed in Albania and tried to make a difference and build civil society. They were co-opted by the main parties and they became part of the system as well.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? It's linked to Lavinia. The Albanian women I've spoken to in Britain, I was doing some research into human trafficking and modern slavery. They weren't fleeing necessarily corruption or even the absence of belief. They were fleeing the impact and reality of blood feuds. And I'm not sure of the scale of that. I still don't. In other words, a different belief system about the nature of loyalty or revenge. Is that narrative of resonance to either of you, really? Or is it just woes affecting a small minority of women who managed to escape the threats of human traffickers here in Britain?
Well, I mean, so Lediana will probably know a lot more about this because Shpresa does exactly this. They kind of deal with victims of trafficking. And so they will have a much better. My impression is that the blood feuds in Albania are very limited. They're limited to a particular territory of Albania, and they're not, in general, a kind of massive society problem. But there is domestic violence. That is much more widespread, and that has been rising. There is a lot of sexism. It was traditionally a sexist society, even in the communist period, where there were these discourses around women and emancipation and so on. And I write about this a bit in the book, the fact that, yes, there were women, they could work anywhere they wanted, but it meant that effectively they had two jobs, one outside and one inside the household, because they didn't have an equal organization of domestic labor. So, but then even that is now gone, because it's not like the state structures, the support that there was with nurseries and with kindergartens. And so all of these things have become services that get sold. So women are really, and it's now a class society like everywhere else. So poor women are really at the mercy of their husbands. They're much more dependent than they used to be financially, as well as in all these other dimensions to do with stereotypes and so on. So I think, you know, someone who runs away from Albania and comes and says, I'm a victim, they don't have to be a victim of a direct blood feud. They can just be a victim of domestic violence, but which is just as murderous as a blood feud. You know, if your husband kills you, that does it matter whether you were killed because of a blood feud or because you were killed by a violent husband? I mean, at the end of the day, it is a systemic problem as well. So, and I think that is a massive problem in Albania, not to speak of, you know, homosexuality, LGBT, all these things that are, again, things that are only just now beginning to be talked about. It's a very masculinist society. And I think capitalism hasn't helped in terms of giving power to men and money and resources that they could then use to oppress women. So.
Yeah, it's true. I completely agree with what Lea said. And of course, I would add the forced marriages, because it's still, we are not talking about Tirana, because Tirana is only one city. And if you go a bit further in the suburbs, even Tirana is like this. But forced marriages are a real thing in Albania, especially for very young girl. You can call them children, and the family forced them to marry someone. And many of the cases are that they are forced to marry someone who is abroad, because the parents think that she will have a brighter future outside Albania. And this is where the trafficking and everything else starts.
I'd like to bring Marita in now, if possible, as well, because Marita, you've got your hand up. Do you want to just unmute yourself and join the conversation?
Yeah, thank you for your time. Hi, Lea. What a great Zoom call. I'm sorry I joined a bit late because I had to work, but I am Marita, the founder of Successful Mothers. I live in England for 24 years now. Last week I was in Tirana, Albania, in a women's conference, and I met Lea's mother, actually, and she is amazing. She's a beautiful lady. My question to you is, I know you kept diary when you, especially at the difficult time when Albania was going through the changes. How long did you keep it without opening it? Because my question is, my daughter kept diary as well, but it was quite through dark period of time that we were going through as a family, but she didn't open it, and she doesn't want to open it yet. She's not ready for it. What would you say? How long did you keep your diary without opening it? And when you opened it and read it, how did you feel?
Yes, so I started keeping it in 91 when the system was changing in Albania, and I kept daily entries until about 2000. And then I had less until 2004 or 5, and then I think I completely stopped writing in around 2004 or 5. So when you're always writing, you don't think about going back and reading because you're always updating. You don't think of it as a historical project. It's your day-to-day activity. So you don't kind of go back and reread. And I actually haven't reread all of it. So I only returned to the bits of it when I was writing the book, to the bits of it about which I was writing. So I reread my very early diaries about 91, 92. I haven't read my diaries of Italy, which is when I went to study at university. That was also a very hard time. And I actually never got back to them, because just going back to these pages in Albania in 91, 92, that was really hard. And what's really hard about it is to realize just how much we have swallowed, actually. Again, it goes back to this thing that I was saying earlier. You just don't speak of trauma and you don't speak of discomfort. It becomes normalized. And so when I read it now, and I think, you know, I was a teenager and spent my entire teenage years locked at home. We didn't go anywhere. I finished school, went home at 2 p.m. That was it. And then, you know, maybe if there was a birthday party or something, it was always in the morning. On Sunday morning, there was a kind of party. I don't know what kind of generation people from Albania are here, but like they will remember the early 90s if they're my generation, 91, 92, 93, up to 97, which is when I left. Up to 97, which is when I left Albania. I spent an entire childhood and teenage years. Childhood was different, it was communism. Teenage years entirely locked at home with nothing to do, no clubs, no, there was Soros debates. That was every now and then what would give you the kind of exciting thing to look forward to. But can you imagine any teenage child being, this was before social media, before telephones, before anything, without opening up to the world? And when I read it now, I felt really sorry for myself, because I think like, you know, this was a really huge cost that generations of people have absorbed without even writing about it. Yeah. And in addition to that, there was this, what I think about now, this generational burden, that if you complained about this in the 90s, my parents would say, well, you would be in a mine, you would be in prison if it was still communism. So what are you talking about? You're complaining because you can't go to a party after 6 o'clock in the evening? I mean, what is that? That's nothing. But meanwhile, your life is gone, you know, my teenage years are gone. So, yeah. And I kind of feel now, I mean, I don't know if I'm being selfish, but I kind of feel a bit sorry for myself when I read it and think about how much I was made to absorb of the trauma of my parents and of communism and how there's this whole generation of people in Albania that has had to do exactly that.
Yeah. Thank you. And did you hesitate to go to some parts of the diary to read because there was a lot of emotions involved? Or
no, because I didn't remember what I would find. So okay. I had no idea what I had written. So when I went back to reread it, I was surprised. I was actually shocked. It was like I was reading myself, but it was like reading someone else, and was feeling really miserable for this on behalf of this 14-year-old girl, 15-year-old girl who was having to spend her entire day just reading books at home with this little candle, because there was also no electricity at the time. So, you know, you had power cut at some point. And so I was just with this tiny candle in my room with a blanket because there was no heating, and just reading books. And yeah.
And that's so valuable. That's the power of reality, I think, just bringing that reality now, when at that time you maybe didn't think much of it, but now how much it means now.
No, exactly. I mean, so now it's also perspective, and it's a perspective on a lot of things. It's a perspective on how you engage with your children, with how to frame certain discourses. Sometimes I feel like I'm telling them, come on, like, what are you complaining about? You're in London and so on. And then I feel like my parents were saying these things to me, and I'm doing the same.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Lea.
Thank you, Marita. I just want to see if Ulsi has written something really long in the chat, which kind of relates to this in terms of what Albania was like in the 90s. Ulsi, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all or ask a specific question, but if anyone hasn't read it, it's worth looking at.
I can't see the chat.
I think he's there. We can share it with you afterwards anyway. There's quite a lot of nice thoughts and stories being shared there. Adela, can I come to you next, please?
Yes, hi, this is Adela, and I am Albanian. I have left Albania in December of '96. So while I went through a lot of the experiences that Lea describes in her book, I did not experience the events of 1997, which were quite traumatic. But my point is, I want to thank Lea for her book. It serves a big purpose in many ways. To the curiosity of the Westerners, it is probably a discovery, but it is a book that navigates historical, philosophical concepts that we as contemporaries of Lea, maybe a few years older, also can relate to. And I would say it does a great service to our children who are born outside of Albania. I myself live in the United States. And I wanted to thank Lea for that. I know she's gotten much praise from many prestigious institutions and individuals, etc. But I think we as the people of Albania, and specifically a subcategory of people who went through similar experiences, need to give her a big thank you.
Thank you. That means a lot to me, and also because, as you know, the book has had some controversy in Albania, and one of the criticisms that I get is that the book doesn't speak for everyone in Albania. So it's really nice when I hear that it does actually speak for some people and that it resonates with people from a similar generation. So I'm really
it speaks to a lot of people, Lea, and I was fascinated at the emotional intelligence with which you've written it, and the nuances with which you've written it. And I would say that maybe some of the experiences that you describe are unique even for an Albanian public. Not everybody comes from that particular social, economical class that your family belong to. And even for Albanians, the Albanian paradox was so great that even within the Albanian society, which was oppressed as a whole, there were subgroups that had more profound experiences, that of your family, and many similar ones like that being one. It's very interesting to me also to see how you perceived the change of the system in the very early years. And I say that from the position of someone who was a organizer of non-governmental organizations, who did a lot of work with training the trainers. And at some point in time, actually, Lea, the world is small. I used to be part of the group of people running the youth center of the Open Society. And one of the projects that we were supporting were the debate project, in which you were a participant. So I actually will touch base on this with a little bit of nostalgia, and I want to say that maybe that was a first venue in which you could find yourself in the public speaking arena and develop that thought process and the debate skills that then continued in that, you of course have accomplished a lot more by now, but I look at that with a little bit of nostalgia. There's a lot of criticism in the Albanian public about that time and what that organization did, and I think most people who are critical come from it from an outside biased view and have really no idea what it was really about.
No, it was definitely transformative for me. It really shaped me in many more ways than I can describe. But yeah, it was really important and formative.
Amazing recollections being shared there. I want to come back to Lorenzo. I know has another question, and then Claudio. But if anybody else has a pressing question, I'm looking at the clock and we haven't got a huge amount of time. But do just put your hand up, and I will try and fit that all in. So Lorenzo, if you can bear in mind that time is limited now, but lovely to hear another question from you.
If Claudio, if you want to go ahead, since you haven't had time so far, I can go after.
Okay, I can go ahead. So as an Albanian to an Albanian, I wanted to ask you, do you think, considering, the current migrant problem, do you think our government should also try to do more to tackle this problem and try to have more dialogue with countries, including the UK? I don't know, for example, to propose, a policy, for example, because as you mentioned before, there is a shortage regarding low qualified jobs, and maybe, the creation of a special migration program, this could be perhaps like a solution. It would be basically a win-win situation for both the UK and for the migrants. And in this way, there wouldn't be any problems regarding the legality of migrants, and there wouldn't be demonization as we have seen lately. And why, nobody's talking about solutions, but we always talk about problems. And we see that particularly in the UK, but also on the Albanian side, maybe that would be the best thing to do. What do you think, your opinion as an academic and as a migrant yourself, what could be the solution?
Well, so I mean, so this is where it becomes very difficult, because there are two ways of looking at the problem of migration in general. So there's the immigration angle and there's the immigration angle. And there is a risk that when we say, you know, there is a problem with immigration, and that we try and criticize British authorities for this anti-immigrant rhetoric and so on, there is a risk of absolving the Albanian governments from the responsibility that it has in enabling brain drain and migration and so on. I mean, that is also a structural problem, right? So if people leave the country because there is no hope, there is no alternative and so on, the ruling classes, the ruling elite needs to take responsibility for that. They can't hide behind the fact that you are criticizing Britain for using the problem of migration and kind of scapegoating immigrants and targeting your community as a way of distracting attention from the fact that you also have your responsibilities as a sending society. So I feel like the discussions around migration in receiving societies and in sending societies have to have very different categories through which they are conducted and analyzed. One of the worries I have is that the Albanian government, on the one hand, is playing completely to the hands of the British government in securitizing and talking about police cooperation and security. And so just kind of accepting the agenda, basically, and not pushing enough on that. But on the other hand, as I say, also using that entire discourse as a way of just not talking about, well, why are citizens leaving your country? Why is this that 30 years after you still haven't solved the migration problem? And of course, you know, you hear the discourse and they say, well, it's because of inequality and it's because of life will always be better in Britain and so on. But that's not true. You know, to leave your country, it's not just that you want to have the same as London. It's also when you feel really there's despair and there's no hope where you are. So it's not that Albania needs to be equal to the United Kingdom for people not to leave Albania. But what it does need to offer is a sense of perspective in the country that, you know, it's worth fighting, it's worth struggling, it's worth doing something. And if young people feel like they're worthless because if they try to make a change, they just get co-opted and swallowed by the system and end up kind of serving the system, then they leave because there's no hope. So I think the government needs to take responsibility for that. And they can't just say, oh, it's just a question of inequality in general. So I feel like, yes, there is a lot of things that we can do from a policy perspective. We can argue that, you know, if we had legal channels, if there were visas that were given more easily to Albanians, if there was more kind of seasonal labor and seasonal frameworks of labor recruitment and so on, then you wouldn't have illegal immigration. But none of that would solve, I think, the basic problem, which is that people are leaving Albania because they don't find an alternative. They don't think there is an alternative. And for that, you really need to change the discourse in the country. And people need to just get out of this logic that they have of like, there's this individual who is corrupt and this other individual who is corrupt. They need to be able to talk about the system as something that goes beyond there's this person and that person. And the problem I have in Albania is that politics is so personalized that you can never understand when you go there, what are the policies? What is the difference between the government and the opposition? So I'm on the left and I have a left take on various things, but I never see a discussion around, you know, what is foreign policy in Albania? What is domestic policy? What is social policy? How do we think about the place of Albania in Europe? How do we think about the place of Albania in the world? You don't know what people think about these things. What are the positions of different parties? I have no idea. What do we think about taxation? All of this, it's completely swept under the carpet, and it's all about this person did this and this person used the plane to go here and this person did this other thing. And I mean, that's all fine, but it needs to be a little bit more than that, I think.
No, I think that's really helpful, and I think there's a number of people here in the chat as well that would be really helpful to kind of coalesce a discussion around this. Lorenzo, would you like to ask your question, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to ask you, since you mentioned it, and since like it's the following part of your book, I was curious and out of interest, what's your relationship with Italy? And like how it's been arriving in Rome in that specific phase of your life, and studying also at Sapienza, which is where I studied as well. So
yeah, well, Italy was very formative for me. It was really actually both formative and transformative. It was intellectually transformative because I think it opened up a way of thinking about political thought and philosophy and intellectual traditions that I was just not familiar with when I was coming from Albania, and it taught me to be critical and to think about, you know, where I was coming from. So I think it all intellectually, I owe a lot of debt to that country because that's where I was trained and that's where I was kind of shaped and where I learned to read certain things and where I started to think about Marxism in a slightly different way from how I had been taught to think about it in Albania. And so I feel like it kind of opened my eyes. And I mean, about politics, I feel like it's the same as where everywhere else in Europe is right now. And so I'm not particularly fond of the politics of the country. I never was, but I think I have very strong links intellectually.
Thank you. Right, thank you. I mean, I feel like we could carry on for at least another half an hour, probably another hour, probably weeks of this. Actually, there's so much thought and energy in the room at the moment. But I think we do need to kind of come to a close. And one of the things I just wanted to briefly share is something that one of my colleagues emailed me today. She couldn't join us. And she is from Denmark. She's recently arrived to the UK from Denmark, and her family are originally from Kurdistan, the Iraq part. And one of the things she said, she'd listened to that podcast where you describe about your mother coming to this country, and she found it really, really helpful and really uplifting. She's had similar knockbacks in terms of visa applications, and she shared the podcast with her immigration lawyer, and they're looking at that in a different way as well. So I think in some of these things, just sharing these stories and sharing these experiences is really powerful, because you realize how other people have made their way through or made their way around things as well. So a really personal thank you from her to you, Lea, for that.
Thank you.
And as Tom said, yeah, thank you, Lea, for weaving together a story of a search for freedom, escape from despair, and wandering around in the Netherland of nostalgia. It's been a fascinating hour and a half. Thank you to everybody who has played a part in listening and debating and thinking about these issues. I think ENORB have got other events coming up. I don't know if you want to mention those now, but actually it would be great to see you here for something else. And it would be great maybe if we follow up with an email, and if there's people who want to get involved in this discussion, we can maybe take some of that forward as well. I know ENORB has some plans to do some work around Albania later in the year. So Lorenzo and Claudia, do you want to add anything to that before we sign off?
Sorry, this is my phone.
Go for it. I was trying to work out whose phone it is. Do you need to go? If you need to go, no, that's absolutely fine. But thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, no, it's fine. Thank you.
I wanted to add, Lea, that it was a great honor and pleasure and even pride. I mean, especially for us, you know, for the people who belong to the Albanian community, to have you here to discuss about this topic, because it's very relevant. It has always been. We see that migration remains a problem, although actually it could be the solution if the politicians could know how to cooperate with that. We thank you very much for finding the time to come here, and we look forward to keeping in touch with you. And a big thank you to the audience for having joined us. We will continue with other upcoming events regarding European Book Club. Stay updated. We will let you know about everything soon.
Thank you. And I just wanted to thank all of you for having me. And thank you also, especially to the Albanians, because I know a lot of what I say is very familiar, and sometimes they're very patient listening to a lot of very familiar things. But then I also really appreciate their feedback. So thanks, everyone, for coming and staying.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.